Hello and welcome back to Bicycle Legs and another edition of In Defense of. And today I have a guest on the show. It's Todd Evans, who was here for one of my Rush episodes previously. Hello, Todd. It's evening where you are, isn't it?
Yeah, 7 in the evening. Everything's going good.
Thanks for coming back on the show and
Sure.
doing this with me. And today we're going to be talking about Chicago. I've already done an episode of Chicago on the channel where I talked about my favorite Chicago album, which is Chicago 5. But today we're doing an In Defense of episode, and we're going to be talking about Chicago in the 80s. Because for a lot of people, Chicago in the 80s, all they think of is power ballads. And what Todd and I are going to do is we're going to talk about the 5 albums they recorded in the 80s, and we're going to try and dispel this myth that Chicago was just about power ballads in the 80s. So Todd, can you give us a little bit about your experiences with Chicago in the 80s?
Okay. Well, Chicago was the first band that I got into when I think I was in the 8th grade or the 9th grade when I started listening to them, which would have made it about 79, 78, 79. And they were the first band that wasn't Kiss or Aerosmith that I ever listened to, or the Partridge Family. So they were actually my first, what I consider to be grown-up bands, the classic rock bands. And so I started there. And so when I started listening to Chicago, Hot Streets was the new Chicago album. And I was in band, and my band director really liked Chicago. And I remember when I was in the 9th grade, my band director wheeling in the television and playing a videotape, which was a 3/4 inch U-matic tape. It was before videotape was really mainstream, of Chicago performing Alive Again. It was their first TV performance after Terry Kath's death. And
Yeah.
so he showed that to us like in school because he thought it was significant, and he wanted us to all see it. And so that's how far back I go. And I've been a big Chicago fan ever since. And I've kind of gone through phases where I was always an apologist for Chicago. I followed Chicago all the way through the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. And sometime in the 2010s, I started going, I think I'm going to jump off this perpetual Chicago defense. But it is funny. And after the last couple of years, I'm kind of back on it. I'm kind of back on to giving them the benefit of the doubt. Chicago is a very complicated band. There's a lot of politics, and there's a lot of issues with management, and a lot of things happen. I read a couple of years ago, it's probably about 8 or 9 years ago, this book right here by Danny Serafine called "A Street Player: My Chicago Story." There's a lot of great information in this book, and it talks a lot about what happened during the not so good years for Chicago. Yeah. And so I've always been kind of a Chicago scholar. And so I'm a pretty big fan.
Yeah, well, I certainly am too. I mean, for me, as a kid, I was familiar with a couple of the hits, which were the power ballads, things like "If You Leave Me Now" and "Hard to Say I'm Sorry." But I really got into Chicago when I was 13. It was 1984, and I went to my old primary school, and they had a fete, and part of that was a Trash and Treasure. And I picked up at that Trash and Treasure for 50 cents each a copy of Chicago Transit Authority and Chicago 5. And that's where my Chicago journey really, really began. And I started collecting all the albums after that. But, Chicago in the 80s, obviously, for me, probably the first album that came out when I was already a Chicago fan, Chicago 17 had just come out. And then 18 and 19, and albums obviously that we're going to be talking about today. So but we're going to start at the beginning of the 80s with their album from 1980, which is Chicago 14. It's the last album until Chicago 30 that actually was with a Roman numeral instead of a regular number. So Um, tell us a little bit about what this album means to you, and what you think of this album.
Well, when this album came out, it was probably at the height of my Chicago fandom. And I had a very good friend named Tom. Hello, Tom. I don't think he watches YouTube, but he was one of my high school buddies. And the two of us were like known as the big Chicago fans with amongst our little group of friends. And so Chicago 13, the album before this, was the first Chicago album that came out like when I was a fan, and like I waited for release day and went to get it. So Chicago 14 is only the second one that I got on release day. And me and my friend Tom, we thought this album was fantastic. We thought that this was like a career topping album at the time it came out. I always liked 13 and I always liked Hot Streets, but I thought that this was just leaps and bounds above both of those. And I was completely baffled when it flopped. I mean, I just had no idea what happened. I just assumed it would be huge. And so my experience with this album is that I liked it when it first came out, and I've always liked it very, very much. I think it's really strong. Produced by Tom Dowd, who was known before that for producing like Lynyrd Skynyrd and Rod Stewart and like really mainstream rock people, and completely gimmickless recording. Just turn on the recorder and record the instruments without any a lot of effects. A really pure drum sound. It's funny, this album. Well, do you mind if I go through some of the tracks and I can
Please.
So it starts with Manipulation, which is a Robert Lamb song. It's a really hard rocking song. And it's kind of like halfway between hard rock and it's kind of fusiony as well. And just really, they got a new guitar player on this album. Donnie Dacus, the guy who was the guitar player on the two previous albums, didn't work out. He had kind of a little bit of a crazy manic stage presence that they weren't comfortable with. And so they got this guy named Chris Pinnock, who basically just stood there. He was a big guy, basically just stood there and played, and that was it. But he played really well. And on Manipulation, he plays just this blistering solo. And, so it starts with that song. It was supposed to be, I've heard Robert Lamb say in interviews that Manipulation was supposed to be their foray into like new wave and punk. And it sounds more like rock fusion to me, but yeah. But anyway, it goes from that into Upon Arrival, which is a honest to God war protest song, basically about women waiting for their soldier husbands to come home, and one of them doesn't come home, and they hadn't done a song in that, and like an anti-war song like in many years. And so that was a surprise to me. It's a really strong song. Robert Lamb sings the bridge on it, but it's mainly Peter Cetera. Peter Cetera kind of rules on this album. He basically sings a lot of the songs. I always thought the third song for You was really strong. Peter sings in a lower register on that song, and I think that they thought that was going to be a big hit, and it was not. Where Did the Lovin' Go, which I think is one of, if I had to pick a top 15 Chicago songs, I would put that in there. I think it's a really good song. It's a ballad, but it also kind of has some rock parts to it. And then Birthday Boy is sung by Peter, but is written by Danny and David Hawk Walensky from Rufus used to write songs together, and they wrote a couple of hits for Chicago, and that was the last time they ever wrote a song together. And then you flip it over and there's this song called Hold On, which is basically so heavy that it's almost comical. I mean, it's just it's kind of a dumb song. It's got kind of stupid lyrics, but it really rocks pretty hard, which is welcome, because the first side's pretty, other than Manipulation, is pretty mellow. Overnight Cafe is almost a bass solo with a song built around it. It's great playing by Peter. Thunder and Lightning is a great song. It's kind of the closest thing. I kind of think, the album before that, Chicago 13, they did that song called Street Player, which is kind of their disco song. Thunder and Lightning is also kind of a disco song, but it's got a little bit more of a hard edge. And then you've got I'd Rather Be Rich, which is kind of another protest song. It's kind of poking fun at rich people and their shallow lifestyles. And then The American Dream is also kind of a protest song, kind of a weak one. It's kind of difficult to kind of figure out what they're trying to complain about in that song. But it's, weighty topics, good engineering, great singing. I think the album's really good. And it's the least popular Chicago album that's not a greatest hits album. That's its claim to fame. And it actually, I don't know if there's any, let me see if there's any stats on how well it did. I think it got
to like number 71 on the Billboard
chart,
it's something ridiculously low.
Yeah, really abysmal. And the album that comes closest to it is Chicago 21, which also from the 90s, which is the second least popular Chicago album. But I don't understand it. I've always thought it was a good album. I've always thought that the songwriting was good, and it sounds really good. It's a different sound for Danny Seraphine. It's a much beefier sound for him.
Yeah.
And it's the last time you're going to hear him play the drums for a very long time, which we'll get to as we move on.
Well, this is a top 10 Chicago album for me. No doubt about that. And
for me, it's probably number 2 or number 3.
Can we talk about how good that cover is too?
Oh, it's
one
excellent.
Of my favorite.
And the way the sleeve has the little thumbprint on the inside, like where you would touch it to pull it out. It's so cool.
Like there.
It won an award.
It's got the fingerprints on that side too. So.
Yeah.
But
it was nominated for a Grammy for Best Album Package. It should have won. I don't know who won that year.
But this is an incredible album. You talk about Manipulation supposed to be their sort of, foray into new wave or punk. There's actually a B-side from these sessions called Doing Business. And I think that's much more of got a punk feel to it.
Yeah, I do too.
Than Manipulation does. It's a great song, and I wish it was on this album. It's a fabulous song. But Manipulation's just a crunchy album opener, really sort of frenetic and energetic, and I really, really love it. Upon Arrival is a beautiful song, and it's, I think, the only song in the whole Chicago catalog that's a co-write between Robert and Peter.
Mm-hmm.
Except for Getaway on Chicago 16, Robert gets a co-writing credit on that with Peter and David Foster. But Song for You is a lovely ballad. And I when I was a teenager, that song used to really, really sort of affect me emotionally. I thought it was absolutely beautiful. Where Did the Lovin' Go? Yeah, again, lovely song. And, there's some great horn playing on this album. To me, I love Chicago with horns. And that's one of the criticisms as we go into the 80s catalog that a lot of people had with those Chicago albums, is that there weren't enough horns on them. I think there are some songs, as we'll get into it, where there's some really, really great horn playing on those albums, but we'll get to that. Birthday Boy, yeah, lovely song. Again, quite sort of emotionally affecting, I think. Hold On, I Agree, is a bit of a silly song, to the point where Peter's even singing it in a kind of a silly voice. Like he did that a couple of times on Chicago 13 as well. There were a couple of tracks on there that are credited to PC Mobley, where it's basically Peter Cetera putting on a silly voice.
I was not thrilled about those tracks where he did that, but
no, absolutely
they're good songs, but I don't like the fake.
He did it a bit on his first solo album too, which was a bit of a shame, because I love that solo album.
Me too.
I wanted to, if I'd been on Peter Kerr's show where he was talking about pop artists that can play hard rock, I was going to pick Peter Cetera's Living in the Limelight, because I think that's a perfect example of that. But Overnight Cafe, I agree with you. It's sort of a bass solo with the song, and again, you talk about this is kind of the last we'd hear of Danny Seraphine playing drums, it was also very much the last we'd hear of Peter Cetera playing bass. Because
Yeah, we're
going
gonna get
on,
into
there
that.
was, on the next several albums, he basically just became a singer, and a
Yeah.
lot of the bass was synth bass. But Thunder and Lightning's a great song. I've always loved that. I first heard that song before I managed to pick up a copy of this album. There was a compilation album that I had picked up, which I think is called Take Me Back to Chicago. And that has Thunder and Lightning on it. And I fell in love with that song there. So it's great to hear it on this album. I'd Rather Be Rich. Yeah, as you say, protest song about sort of, why do we have, need so much money just to be able to get by in this world? Was originally demoed in 76, around the time of Chicago 10. There's a demo version of it on the remastered version of Chicago 10. It's quite different to what they would end up with here. And The American Dream, yeah, I mean, it's the only song written by James Pankow. And I always do love a good James Pankow song. The lyric, yeah, a little muddled, but I kind of get what he's trying to get at. It's sort of like a criticism of politicians and, Capitol Hill gridlock and that sort of thing.
It's very vague and safe, but it's better than not having a protest song at all. So
yeah, but there's some great horns on it. And yeah, Tom Dowd's production is lovely and kind of dry. It just lets the instruments be. It doesn't put lots of reverb or weird effects or whatever. It's a much better production for me. I love Phil Ramone and the work that he does on like Billy Joel albums, but I didn't think he was a particularly great producer choice for Chicago. I like Hot Streets a lot. 13 I find patchy.
Yeah, me too.
But the production on those two albums, I don't particularly like the way the horns sound on those two albums, whereas they sound great on this album. I think, Tom Dowd's had a lot of experience. He was a producer with Atlantic for a while, and so he's had a lot of work, a lot of experience recording horns. So I think that's why they sound great on this album. But yeah, this is a terrific Chicago album, and definitely the overlooked gem in the Chicago catalog, without a doubt.
There's really the only thing I could think of for somebody who is kind of lukewarm on Chicago who would hear this album. The only thing I can think of that they could complain about is that it's kind of mellow on side one, but other than that, it's totally solid.
And of course, it's one of only two Chicago albums. The next one we're going to talk about, Chicago 16, being the other, where there's only two lead vocalists. There's only Peter and Robert on this one. So that's a good segue into talking about the next one, Chicago 16.
Yep.
Now, this was a big comeback for them, obviously. You want to sort of tell us about your thoughts on this album?
Yeah, well, Chicago 16, I remember my impression of this when it came out was that I thought that Hard to Say I'm Sorry Getaway was absolutely fantastic. And it felt like they had gone to another level as far as production. But at the same time, I found the album to be as a Chicago fan, to be very disappointing because there was so much outside writing going on. And I recognized some of the names. I recognized some people from Toto, who was a band that I also liked at the same time and still do now. But I remember looking at that and thinking, why does Chicago need help? They've got like 4 or 5 songwriters in that band. Why would they need help? So apparently what happened was they demoed and wrote songs for this album, and they were when they got in touch with David Foster told them to start over. I think there's I'm not going to say how Peter Cetera described the songs that they had, but it was a very unkind word, and so apparently, as a Chicago fan, I want to hear those because I would like to hear what they came up with after 14, being at the low point where they were. Columbia Records dropped them. They actually ended up paying the band to leave their contract because
Yeah.
they signed a contract that said that Columbia basically had to give them $1 million to record every album. And
Yeah.
so they were at Columbia Records was just like, please go, whatever it takes.
Yeah, well, you
Which
wonder why Columbia signed that deal, because they were coming off 13 at the time, and 13
Yeah,
was not a big seller. I mean,
no,
Hot
it
Streaks had
wasn't.
done well. It had gone platinum, but
Yeah, and
13 had not done well.
the band blames an overzealous manager for dragging them into that deal. But I think that Columbia getting out of the deal was very short-sighted. These were still young men.
Yeah.
I mean, they were in their 30s. This was not a band that was over the hill. So I've always thought that was a little short-sighted and it's their fault for signing the terrible deal.
Yeah.
But but as far as this album goes, it's funny. David Foster, I have mixed feelings about David Foster. I think that David Foster is kind of a genius. There are things that he does on some albums. There are things that he's done on some of Peter's albums that have just been magical. Where you just listen to him and you think, oh, that's an arrangement that only David Foster could do. But I think he's super talented. But you have to wonder, a guy that comes into to sessions, to planning stages for an album like this, and it's basically his first thing is he looks at Peter Cetera and the rhythm section of Peter Cetera and Danny Seraphine and says, okay, well, these two clowns have to go. It's like one of the best rock rhythm sections ever. Anybody who really knows anything about Chicago knows that Peter Cetera is a great bass player. Danny Seraphine is a great drummer and very unique style of playing fills. And to just say, okay, well, we need to make something really popular. So, that's going to go. We're going to do this different. We're going to program everything, and it's going to be simple, and it's not going to be overcomplicated. And I understand why he did that. It just seems crazy to me.
Yeah.
There's a story that I heard, and I can't cite where I heard it because I don't remember, but there was for a while in the about 10 years ago, Danny Seraphine, this former Chicago drummer, was pretty active on Facebook, and you could ask him stuff. And I asked Danny about this. Supposedly, Peter Cetera showed up for the sessions with his bass, was getting his bass out, and David Foster came out and said, "You're not going to play bass on this album. We're doing synth bass." And Peter Cetera closed the case and said, "I was sick of playing anyway," and went home for like 3 weeks. And came back to do the vocal tracks. And I asked Danny about that. I said, is there any truth to that? And Danny said, well, I can't confirm it, but it does sound like something Peter would have said.
Yeah.
So I always thought that was really interesting. So, but as far as the album goes, really quick, What You're Missing doesn't sound like a Chicago song. Waiting for You to Decide doesn't sound like a Chicago song. Bad Advice and Chains, neither one of those sound like Chicago songs. They sound like some kind of mix between a Toto song and, I don't know, maybe Foreigner. I'm not really even sure. But Hard to Say I'm Sorry, Getaway is fantastic. And you gotta wonder about I think Peter Cetera wrote that with David Foster, and then Getaway was something that Robert Lamb had, and they kind of married them together. And they used all these outside writers, and Hard to Say I'm Sorry is where the album just kind of opens up and you go, wow, that sounds like a really good Chicago song. And supposedly Robert Lamb was going through some trouble. He was going through some personal stuff, and he was really unhappy with what was going on with them doing with David Foster's approach on this album. And so he just kind of stayed out of things. But Hard to Say I'm Sorry I think is brilliant. People make fun of it for being a sappy ballad, but if you're one of those kinds of people who only likes rock, this Chicago in the 80s is not for you, really. I mean, it's got there's some rock music there, but there's some really great things happening in this decade with this band. There's some bad, kind of not so great things happening too, but there's some of this some of this stuff is really pretty good. And I think Hard to Say I'm Sorry is one of those things that is actually really good.
Yeah.
Side two is interesting because side two is the first time you hear Bill Champlin sing lead.
Yeah.
And so that was another thing when I was, in high school. I think I was a senior in high school when this came out. I was thinking to myself, they don't have a guitarist. Why would they hire another keyboardist? And I figured that they might have done it because they needed a gruff voice, for somebody to sing Terry Kath's parts. And so I get that. And Champlin's a fantastic musician. But when you get to What Can I Say? What Can I Say is actually the only song on this album where Danny plays a drum kit. And you almost don't notice it because it doesn't sound that much different. And it sounds like they're really telling him to keep it simple. But for my money, Hard to Say I'm Sorry, What Can I Say, and Love Me Tomorrow are the three best songs.
Yeah.
And Rescue You is almost not even there. It makes no impression on me whatsoever. But I think Love Me Tomorrow is really great. The arrangement's really great. It's really classy. I like it a lot. Now, people rag on Chicago for being just a whole bunch of sappy ballads, but side one of this album, even though it doesn't sound like Chicago, it does rock.
Yeah.
First four tracks, they are rock songs, and you don't get to a ballad until the last song on side one. So that's kind of an invalid criticism for this album. But to me, it sounds like a committee of suits put together something that sounds like a Chicago album.
Yeah.
But I still like it.
Look, I agree with a lot of what you said, but I mean, the thing is, I've read Danny Seraphine say that that's basically what they got David Foster in to do.
And he's
we don't want you to make a Chicago record. We want you to make a hit record.
Yeah, and he was okay with it. He was okay with being replaced. Later on, he gets to be where he makes some requests, but for 16, he was just like, whatever you want to do, boss.
Yeah. And I mean, the big disappointment for me on this album is the lack of Robert Lamb.
Yeah, me too.
Robert Lamb is my favorite member of Chicago. So, I picked Chicago 5 as my favorite Chicago album when I did one of my favorite albums of all time episodes. Robert Lamb writes 8 out of the 10 songs on that album. I just adore that out. That's all right. I absolutely adore his songwriting.
Yeah, me too.
And there's none of it here. I always felt like, the writing credit on Getaway was almost a pity writing credit, as it were. It was like, oh, we've got to throw Robert something. I've read again quotes from Robert saying that, you were alluding to the fact that he was very unhappy and going through some personal issues at the time. I've read that he said, he was very much on the edge of leaving the band at this point. Mm-hmm. And that may be why they brought Bill Champlin in too. It was like they thought, we're going to lose Robert, we need another keyboard player.
Yeah.
But I think also Bill Champlin's definitely there, as you said, to be that sort of gruff Terry Kath kind of voice. And when you see concert footage of the band from the 80s and the 90s, he does sing those Terry Kath songs really well.
Very well, yeah.
I think Bill Champlin's a phenomenal singer. I absolutely love him.
And when that band starts to fragment even more in the 2000s, he's kind of the rock. He's kind of the main guy who really brings it. Yeah.
But, I agree with what you say about what you're missing and waiting for you to decide. They don't really sound like Chicago songs, but I actually quite like them.
I still like them despite that.
Bad Advice, I love. I think that's a great song. It's written by Peter and James Pankow and David Foster. It's got some wonderful horns on it. There's some really great horn playing on that song too.
Yeah, I did say that was written by somebody else outside of the band, and I was mistaken. You're correct on that.
But it's one of the great shining moments for the horns on this album. I remember I picked up before I got this album, I picked up the single of Love Me Tomorrow, and Bad Advice was the B-side. And I used to play the B-side as much, if not more, than the A-side. So,
and Bad Advice is where they start with those crazy, really super complicated keyboard kinds of things that happen a lot from here on out.
Yeah, I mean, that starts
Which
right at the
appeals to
beginning.
me.
It starts right at the beginning of the album, doesn't it? It had, you know, that synth intro to What You're Missing.
Yeah.
But yeah, Chains, not it kind of, it's nice while it's there, but it doesn't leave much of an impression. Hard to Say I'm Sorry is a gorgeous, gorgeous song. Getaway is a wonderful sort of outro to it. Again, great shining moment for the horns. And I always loved in concert they would double the length of Getaway just so that they could play that horn riff twice. Follow Me, I love that song. It's a really great, another James Pankow and David Foster song. And Bill Champlin sings it wonderfully, as he does on Sunny Think Twice, which is a song he wrote with Danny. I believe that Danny was kind of instrumental, not in just getting them David Foster, but also in getting them Bill Champlin, because he'd worked a bit with him and written some songs and stuff. So
I forgot to mention that I didn't mean to interrupt, but I forgot to mention that Sunny Think Twice to me has always been After the Love Is Gone Part 2, because it sounds so much to me like that Earth, Wind and Fire song, After the Love Is Gone.
Yeah.
So I've always felt that for some reason.
Yeah. And then, Rescue You and What Can I Say? Again, they're a bit like Chains for me. They're nice while they're on, but they don't sort of leave much of a lasting impression. And Love Me Tomorrow is a beautiful ballad with some really lovely strings on it, especially at the end. It gets faded out early on the single, unfortunately, but on the album, there's this like beautiful string arrangement at the end of the song that just plays the song out. I absolutely love that.
Yeah, me too. That's when you really start thinking Peter's going to be a big star.
Yeah.
That's what I felt when I heard that.
But this album obviously brought Chicago back. It made them a huge success. And then they would go on to the most successful album they ever released in their entire career, which is Chicago 17.
Yep.
This came out in 1984. So what are your thoughts on this one?
17 I liked at the time a lot better than 16. I feel like even though Hard Habit to Break is not written by them, I felt like most of the album is written by them, which is good. There's if I'm not mistaken, there's a Pankow song on this record. And I thought this record was really good. I liked the way I was, it's funny. We were talking about the the drums being replaced by programming. At the time, I didn't know that. I just thought Danny sounds weird. You know what I mean? As far as knowing when drums were programmed and when they weren't, I mean, if you really look really closely at the liner notes for these albums, it suggests that there's some programming that happened. But I was still, by the time this album came out, I was still scratching my head thinking, that doesn't sound like Danny. Is that Danny? What did they do to Danny? And, I feel kind of stupid now in retrospect, but at the time, there was no internet. You couldn't really research it.
Yeah.
You could just go, okay, well, this sounds like it's drum machines or programmed drums, but I'm not really sure. They say that Danny's playing the drums. So, but besides that, I think Stay the Night is a great song. I think the video is ridiculous, but I think it's a really cool song. And somebody who's a fan of Peter Cetera, I think it's a pretty cool Peter Cetera song. I loved We Can Stop the Hurtin' when it came out because I was happy to hear Robert Lamb sing, and I think it's a cool song. I still think it's one of the best songs on this album. Hard Habit to Break, even though it's written by somebody else, it's a great song. It's got that crazy those crazy kind of changes and that weird bridge, and there's that wacky keyboard stuff going on, and at the time that really appealed to me. So I mean, I liked it. I think that gets worse as we go on. I think that starts to get kind of ridiculous as far as those kinds of arrangements. But on Hard Habit to Break, I think it works, and I think that's a pretty song. Even though Peter didn't write it. Only You and Remember the Feeling. I like both of the songs. I think Remember the Feeling is really pretty exceptional. People always talk about You're the Inspiration, but I think I kind of like Remember the Feeling more. Along Comes a Woman is a cool song. He wrote that with Mark Goldenberg, who was in this band called the Cretones, which is kind of like a power pop band, and he became buddies with Mark Goldenberg, and he wrote a couple songs with him along the way. You're the Inspiration is a good solid Peter song. It's funny. It's got I don't know if you remember this, but it's got the most ridiculous video. Peter is he's playing the bass, he's wearing a Bauhaus shirt.
Yeah.
Bauhaus t-shirt. And everybody in the band is playing keyboards, except for him and Danny. And it's all the horn players are playing keyboards. And so we talked a lot about that song when I guess by this time I'm in college, but about that video and how ridiculous that is, and why is he wearing a Bauhaus shirt when they're playing this really keyboardy music. Please Hold On is okay. That's a pretty good. Bill Champlin sings that song, I think.
Yes.
And Prima Donna is kind of cool. That was on the Two of a Kind soundtrack, so I heard it before this album came out. But I liked that song. I thought it was pretty cool. And Once in a Lifetime,
that's James
Pankow song, yeah. And it kind of, there's kind of a little mini trend. It doesn't happen on all of these albums, but where the last song on the album is a James Pankow song. It happens on this album and the next album. And
it was on 14 as well.
Yeah. So when Chicago 17 came out, I really liked it, and I still do like it. I think it's better than 16. I think it's better than 18. At this point, I think that's when Peter started saying, and I've read some stuff that suggests that he actually did say the words, "I'm carrying this band. I'm writing all the hit singles." And so that's what he used as his argument when he said, I'd like some time off to do my second solo album. And they denied that. And he said, "I'm carrying this band. You owe that to me." And that's kind of what ended his tenure with Chicago, which I think is ridiculous. The Chicago history is just laden with all of these bad decisions. And that's one of them, in my opinion.
I think what happened with Chicago, and it's been something that's gone through to this day, is that the Robert and the horn section just love touring. They want to tour all the time. And Peter was like, "No, I want some time off. I want to do a solo album, and I want to get off the road for a bit."
Mm-hmm.
And they were like, no, we've got to play this next tour. We've got to do this summer tour, this, that, and the other. And that's what sort of pushed him to the brink. But I mean, one of the things that Robert said, with 16 and why he was so unhappy at the time was that he said we were a faceless band that had a face now. And I think he was unhappy with the fact that Peter Cetera had become the face of Chicago.
And I have some photos. I should have got them out for this, but I have some photos that I took at the Chicago 17 concert, and the way they're dressed is ridiculous. They've got on these big white and beige and like light blue things with shoulder pads, and they're kind of cool in a way, but they kind of go diagonal with the buttons on up here. And Peter Cetera's got this thing that almost looks like he should be in Earth, Wind and Fire, and everybody's dressed that way. They even dressed Chris Pinnock that way. And it's just, when you look at that, you think, oh my gosh, they got so concerned about fashion and how they looked, and that was something that Chicago never did prior to the 80s. But in their defense, everybody was doing that.
Absolutely. It was the MTV
and they weren't old men
generation
yet.
Wasn't it?
They weren't old men yet, so
you had to have that visual presence, and this band had never really had that. They had sort of the big neon Chicago sign in the background, but apart from that, it was just the guys on stage, playing that wonderful, wonderful music.
And, you could probably say that, Terry Kath was really kind of the guy who grounded them as, the musician's musician. And when he was gone, there wasn't anybody to do that. Robert Lamb could have done that, but he stepped back.
Yeah.
So that's what they were left with.
He got very depressed after, Terry died. So,
Mhm.
but yeah, this album, I mean, the thing about this is that they had 4 big hit singles off this album, including 2 that were not power ballads. Stay the
Right,
Night and Along Comes a Woman were both top
right.
20 hits, and they were both up-tempo songs. So, it
Yeah, everybody
showed that,
forgets that.
yeah, it showed that this band could actually have hits without the power ballads. I absolutely agree with you with Remember a Feeling. I think it's the best ballad on the album. It's
Me too.
absolutely gorgeous song, and it's a co-write between Peter and Bill.
Hmm.
The 2 of them wrote that song together. It's one of the few songs that David Foster didn't have a hand in.
Right.
We Can Stop the Hurting. Yeah, absolutely. Robert's back, and it's wonderful. And he also sings half of Only You, which is, I think, a gorgeous song. That's another James Pankow song, although he
Hmm.
co-wrote that one with David Foster. Yeah, Hard Habit to Break is probably my least favorite of the 3 sort of big power ballads on this album. You're the Inspiration. I mean, that's a sort of a wedding staple now, that song, isn't it? But yeah. And Please Hold On, a bit of soul into
Hmm.
the Chicago sound. And I
Yeah.
really like that. And that was co-written with Bill Champlin, wrote that with, among other people, Lionel Richie.
Hmm.
So, yeah, I
Yeah,
definitely
I
agree
think
with
that
you.
that's better than some of the songs on side 2 of 16 that are kind of trying for
Yeah.
that same thing. I think Please Hold On works better.
Um, I definitely agree with you that this is a stronger album than either the one that came before it or after it. So yeah, as you alluded to, Peter Cetera leaves the band after this album, and they
Yep.
get in Jason Schaff, and they record Chicago 18, which, and again, another really nice cover. I really like the
Hmm.
cover of this album. Um, the last album that they would do with David Foster.
Yep.
So yeah, your thoughts on this one?
Okay, well, I thought that getting Jason Schaff was a really good idea. I mean, you're looking for a good bass player that's got a tenor voice that can sing like Peter. Then yeah, that's probably a good idea. Um, let me put it this way: that's probably the best you can do if you fire Peter Cetera, that's probably
Yeah,
the most logical thing to do. This record, unfortunately, as you can see right here, leads off with the first single, a
yes.
completely redone version of 25 or 6 to 4 with completely programmed drums that sound really just not right for that song. And so
Mm,
nobody likes that. So that's everyone's introduction to this, unfortunately for them. Um, this is where now Danny Seraphine went to David Foster at this point, and he said, "If you're gonna program all the drums, at least let me do it." And
yeah,
so on this album, he learned how to use the technology, and he programmed the drums himself. Now he didn't make them sound like anything that he would play. It still doesn't sound like him, but at least he got the credit for doing it and learned how to do
yeah.
it. So it feels like he contributed something. Niagara Falls is written by other people. It's kind of a cool song, but it's the beginning of them trying to rely on that stuff that they tried in Hard Habit to Break a little bit too much. It's got some craziness with the key changes and the tempos where it just kind of loses its center.
Mm.
And so I think there's kind of a good song in there, but there's like a haze over it that doesn't work for me. Forever is another Robert Lamb song, or did he just sing that song?
No, he
No, he
co-wrote
wrote
that
it
one.
too.
Yeah.
Okay. I was happy that it was there when this album came out, but it hasn't it's not that great of a song, and it hasn't really had legs for me over the years. If She Would Have Been Faithful is another. It's basically Hard Habit to Break Part 2, and it again has the craziness, the key changes and
Yeah.
unexpected twists and turns, which, if you don't mind technology in your pop music, pretty cool actually. But again, It's a little better than Niagara Falls, but it still kind of makes the song kind of lose its center, maybe. 25 or 6 to 4, we've already talked about. I don't hate it. I didn't hate it then. I don't hate it now, but not a good idea. I don't think, for them to do that. Will You Still Love Me is, again, much like the album, much like 16 two albums before it, best song in the album, I think. It's written by David Foster and 2 other people, sung by Jason and Bill, and I think it's a really strong song. And it was the single that broke through and kind of saved this album. And I think that it for good reason. I kind of think side 2. You may disagree with me, but I kind of think side 2 is pretty weak. It's kind of throwaway. It's got some okay Champlin stuff on it, and I don't mind any of it. It certainly sounds good. There's a little brass kind of transition between 2 of the songs that's written by Pankow. In between It's All Right and Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now, called Free Fight. That's kind of cool. Why they couldn't develop that into something better to kind of, quiet the critics who were saying there's not enough horns on these albums. If there was this thing that was happening where Chicago was being told, no horns, horns are bad, people don't want horns. And a couple, 3 or 4 or 5 of the members in interviews have said that that's what they were being told.
Yeah.
There's a quote from Robert Lamb from around 16 where he was saying, we were told people don't want to hear horns. And so what were we going to do? We were a band with horns. So I think that was a bad idea. I think Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now, I think, is the first time that Jason Scheff writes something. And I think on later albums after this, he becomes a pretty darn good writer. Yes. And I think One More Day, I really liked that, the James Pankow song that closes the album. I really liked that back then. I think it's kind of cheesy now. It doesn't, the children's chorus kind of doesn't age well for me. But I have to say, these albums, they're produced by David Foster and engineered and mixed by some guy named Humberto Gatica. They're engineered really well for albums that have programmed drums. I mean, I think all of the albums sound really good, and this isn't any exception. But this starts to feel like it's kind of coming apart for them as far as sounding like Chicago for me. But I went to this tour and I got to meet them after the show, and I spoke with Robert Lamb briefly, and I actually have the program, and I looked for it. I couldn't find it. I thought it was in my closet, but I'll never forget that, because I went to Robert Lamb and I shook his hand and I said, Robert, it's really good to hear you singing and writing songs and singing your own songs. And he stopped and he said, "What's your name again?" So he reacted to somebody complimenting him, which I thought was really amusing. But yeah, I mean, I really felt like this whole time, Robert Lamb doesn't do enough. And while I was happy to have, like one song on every album that he writes and sings, I still felt like he wasn't doing enough. And I meant to mention this too, is that there are piano parts on this that don't sound like they're Robert, and I'm pretty sure they're not. There are other keyboardists credited. Same with the album that comes next. It's like there's piano that's just like, that's not how Robert plays. Robert's a really good piano player. Oh, and he's got a distinctive style, and this ain't him. So
I think you'll find on 16, 17, and 18, a lot of the piano is David Foster, actually.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah, I agree with you. Again, I mean, I think this album has its moments, but yeah, I mean, Niagara Falls, I think there's a good song in there somewhere, but they just needlessly overcomplicated the arrangement.
Yeah. And I like complicated arrangements, but that one...
Yeah, but I don't think it works for this song. Complicated arrangements are great, but they don't necessarily work with relatively simple songs, if you know what I mean. Yeah. Forever, again, always love to hear Robert. Again, I think the arrangement's a little bit cluttered, but I like the song, and I always love to hear Robert sing. If She Would Have Been Faithful, yeah, that song doesn't do anything for me. 25 or 6 to 4. Oh, no. and the film clip they did with it, with this sort of like, 1984 kind of feel to it, like George Orwell. I mean,
Yeah,
you know, the
it's an
kids
odd
trying to
choice.
escape the school and the eye that's seeing them and all this sort of thing. It's like, and I think, whose idea was it to redo this song? But then absolutely whose idea was it to then make it the lead single off the album? I mean,
Yeah,
that's just crazy.
they were probably panicked. They were probably thought that they were in a bad spot and they had to do
Probably
something.
without Peter, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean,
But
25 or 64 is just a really simple song about hardworking musicians
yeah,
having to work really hard. And what time is it? Oh, it's like almost 4. And it's like, why they would have a video that wasn't the concept, I have no idea.
yeah.
Sorry.
Again, I think just trying to chase that sort of MTV rotation,
Yeah.
But yeah, Will You Still Love Me? One of their best ballads ever, I think. Absolutely gorgeous song, and sung so beautifully by both
Yeah.
Jason and Bill.
Mhm.
Over and Over on side 2 is another Robert song, and I really like that one. It's an up-tempo song. Yeah, really, really good song. And again, It's All Right. I love that. It's like a rocker from Bill, you know. I mean, the lyrics a bit trite, but the music's really good and driving, and it's a
This
really good
isn't a
rock
mellow
song.
album.
Yeah.
It really isn't.
But nothing's going to stop us now. Yeah, Jason would write better songs for Chicago than that one. But first go, I don't know how much time he had to prepare material for this album before he came in. I believe is not a great ballad. And then One More Day, yeah, it's a good song, but I do agree with the sort of the children's chorus hasn't aged well, but I still like the song quite a bit.
Yeah, me too. It's hard to find a bad Pankow song. It really is.
Yeah.
They're all pretty solid.
So they would then close out the 80s with Chicago 19. Again, another really funky cover, computer sort of generated image. This would be the last album that Danny Seraphine would play on before he was kind of acrimoniously fired from the band.
Yeah.
Definitely an album where Jason and Bill really become the focal points of the band. So your thoughts on this album?
Well, this album, there are a lot of things about this album that are attractive on first listen. So I was pretty excited about this album when it came out. They did this album because Danny encouraged them to, because he wanted to compete directly with Peter Cetera, who was working pretty prolifically at this point, and he said we should go in the studio and do an album like soon. And so they all agreed, and he got, this is produced by Ron Nevison, most of it, and then the rest of it by Chaz Sanford. Supposedly Danny plays drums on all of this. Supposedly he went to them and said, I want to play the drums on this album. It doesn't necessarily sound like the real Danny. It's almost kind of like the wind was taken out of his sails for all the years where he didn't play. And so when it was time for him to play, he didn't really play anything interesting. So it's really hard to tell that it's not programmed. But it's got a lot of that really late 80s kind of snare, that echoey snare sound, that you've come to expect. And so when he does that, it really makes you wonder if that's really him. But there are a couple of songs where it does sound like he's playing a kit. I think Heart in Pieces is really cool. I think that's kind of it's a gimmicky song in the vein of some of the songs on Chicago 18, but I think it works pretty good. This is where we start seeing Diane Warren show up. So Diane Warren, for people who don't know, is a professional songwriter. She's very successful. She's very good at what she does, and her songs are very, very nice. And I Don't Want to Live Without Your Love, the second song on this album, is a great song. You can disagree with why should Diane Warren be writing Chicago songs? And I would be in that camp as well. But they're good songs. Great vocal by Bill. I Stand Up, the third song, a Robert Lamb song, written by Robert and sung by Robert, and actually written by Robert and Jared McMahon, who's one of his buddies. Again, another Chicago song is written by somebody in the band, sung by the person who wrote it, and not a ballad. So, people think that of these albums as being all ballads, and they're not. But we've said that already. We Can Last Forever is a Jason Scheff song, better than the one that's on 18, and I think that his songs will get better and better as he goes along. Coming from the Night, another Bill song, and then you look at side 2, and you've got Look Away, and that's became a number 1 record in the United States, and it was released. I don't remember whether it was the 3rd single, something like that, but it was way after the album came out. In fact, I don't think it was a single until 89. I don't think it was a single until the following year. But a huge song, and I think a really good one, a Diane Warren song, but you got to give her credit. She writes good songs. What Kind of Man Would I Be is another Jason Scheff song, even better than We Can Last Forever. I think it's one of his best songs. By this time, I think he's getting to be a pretty good songwriter, and he's got some songs on. We're not going to talk about Chicago 21 because it's in the 90s, not a very strong album, but Jason brings good songs to that album. I'm not crazy about the rest of the album. It's certainly Run Around You're Not Alone and Victorious. Are certainly decent songs, and I like them okay. Victorious is a song that's sung by Lamb. It almost sounds like he could have written it, but he didn't. I don't love those 3 songs, but they're pretty good. And they're not sappy ballads again, like people say that this band's catalog in the 80s is all ballads, but it isn't. So there's something about it. Terrible cover. I hate the cover. I hated the cover then. I hate it now. But there's something about it that, again, that doesn't quite feel like a Chicago album, but knowing that Danny played the drums on it and seeing that there are quite a few songs on it that are actually written by the band, I think it's okay.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go against the flow with you a little bit on this one because I have an irrational love for this album.
Okay.
I don't know what it is about this album.
When it's good, it's really good.
Yeah. For me, it's the best album since 14. So
I don't think I disagree with that.
Yeah. Heart in
Except
Pieces.
for maybe 17.
Heart in Pieces is just such a great album opener, really, really energetic. And I mean, yeah, it's got that 80s sound, but everything had that 80s sound in the 80s. And, if you're not into that, then you're just not going to be into a lot of 80s music.
Right.
I think it's a great song. I Don't Want to Live Without Your Love is a nice ballad. I think I agree with you that Look Away is a much better Diane Warren song. I Stand Up. Oh, I love that song. Absolutely adore it. It's the most Chicago sounding song, again, since Chicago 14.
Sounds really good, too. Sounds like a band's playing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which you're not always getting with this band in the 80s.
The whole band sounds like they're playing on this song. Robert sings it beautifully. It's a really, really well-written song. And it sounds like Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I love about that song so much. We Can Last Forever is a nice ballad. Coming from the Night. I love that song. It's a great closer to side 1. Bill has some shining moments on this album, and this is a strong album for him. And then Look Away, again, one of my favorite Chicago ballads from this 80s period. Again, as you said, it's not written by the band, but it's just an undeniably great song. The lyric has heart. The music is beautiful. It doesn't have a crazy arrangement like we were getting on, Chicago 18. What Kind of Man Would I Be? Again, I agree, is probably Jason's best writing effort up to this point. And then the last 3 songs, I like Run Around a lot. You're Not Alone's quite good. And Victorious, probably the weakest song on the album, and a little bit of a a strange choice for me to close the album out. Although, again, I do like to hear Robert on vocals. So,
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, to me, as I say, best album since 14. I really enjoy this album. And probably for me, they wouldn't top this again, probably until I haven't heard the most recent one, but the one immediately before it, I think Chicago 36.
Yeah, now
That's probably the best. That's probably the only album they've done that's topped that for me.
I think so too. I mean, you have to wait until 95 when they released Night and Day, their big band album, to hear Robert play the piano again.
Yeah, I love that album.
You went, oh, there he is.
Yeah, I do love that album, but again, it's an album full of standards, and
right.
As well as they do them, I'm not sure I especially didn't want to hear that after hearing what they were supposed to do with Stoner Sisyphus.
Right. That's a whole other show.
Yeah, exactly. But thank you very much, Todd, for joining me for this show. That's our thoughts on Chicago in the 80s. Please let me know in the comments what you think, where you agree with us, where you disagree with us, what you think of the strongest albums in this run. Would love to hear from you. Please do like, share, and subscribe. It really does help the channel out. If you're new to the channel, please go and have a look at some of my other videos. I do have everything playlisted. So if you want to look at some of my other In Defense Of shows, there's a playlist for that. Or my studio albums ranked, there's a playlist for that. If you want to see my Chicago favorite albums of all time show, there's a playlist for those as well. I'll leave a link in the description for that particular episode as well. If you want to follow me on social media, I'm at bicyclelegs on Instagram and Twitter, and I now have a bicyclelegs Facebook page. There's links for that all in the description. I'd particularly love you to come and follow the Facebook page and join in the conversation there. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.